afternoon. My name is Juan Cartagena, and I work here at Latino Justice Pearl Death in New York City, headquartered here in New York City, but also with offices in beautiful Orlando, Florida as well. We are here, and we are so happy that you are joining us for a webinar entitled The Alarming Lack of Data on Latinxs in the Criminal and Youth Justice Systems. It is a very important conversation that we are hoping that you will also be involved in and engaged in by asking questions at the appropriate time. But now to take us through and moderate this discussion, I am so happy to introduce to you, if you haven't heard of her already, she is the amazing Ana Yanez Correa, an amazing person who's been working on criminal justice reform for quite some time, particularly in places like in Texas, with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, but currently she is a program officer on criminal justice matters, criminal justice program officer at the Public Welfare Foundation. Anna, thank you so much. Please take it away.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you everybody who is listening to us. As Juan articulated, we are at a critical time. Latinos are at a critical time right now. We are being criminalized for just being here. We are being targeted. We are being overly policed. And so this panel is really meant to talk about the numbers. How do we really gauge the impact of failed criminal and juvenile justice policies and the impact that it has on our communities? So to start off this conversation, we have our dear friend Juan. Juan Cartagena is currently the president and general counsel of Latino Justice Pearl Death, a national civil rights public interest law office that represents Latinos and Latinas throughout the country. He is one of the nation's leading voices on equity, equality, and non-discrimination, and he has successfully used the law to effectuate system change, unlike many of the people that I've known. He's an incredible fighter for our people and for other people as well. So Juan, I wanted to talk to you a little bit, and if you can just please tell me about what it really means to have this Latinx data gap. Why should we be concerned about it? Why does it matter to us? Give us a little bit of your perspective about why this is a critical issue right now.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. So effectively, what we are calling on this webinar, the Latino data gap, the Latinx data gap, is a really kind of like nice way to talk about invisibility. And that's what really is the topic of this conversation. To what extent are the systems that affect so many lives in the United States, the systems that start with law enforcement, the systems that then gravitate to the courts and decisions by prosecutors, the systems that then gravitate to decisions by judges and juries, decisions that then gravitate to corrections facilities, whether it's pretrial detention or as well with sentencing after a conviction or plea bargaining, all those systems, and then the systems that exist in between, probationary systems for criminal supervision, the systems regarding parole supervision and monitoring after release from prison. All of these systems basically operate with data that is clearly necessary to run any kind of bureaucracy. The data requires those systems to understand the nature of the people that they are addressing, the nature of the people that they are quote unquote serving, the nature of the people that they are in many cases housing and supervising and monitoring. And in that respect, each of these systems, which we already know in the United States, are engaged in astronomical proportions of very high engagement, whether it's over-policing in our cities, whether it's excessive decision-making by prosecutors to continue to feed the system, whether it's decision by courts and juries to convict, and it's decisions to house in correction facilities. All of these systems operate in a way that we know impacts lives. We also know it's a drain on public resources. We know that fully well. We are now living in the United States, in which the United States is the largest country in the world with a pro rata, per capita imprisonment systems and prison rates that dwarf any other country in the world. When you look at it that way, to say that in 2018, a number of states, and quite a high number of states actually, still don't collect data on how Latinas and Latinos are impacted by each one of these subsystems, cannot actually say what these issues mean in the Latino community, cannot actually pinpoint with accurate data what it really all means for these populations, is an outrageous affront to really how we deal with Latino populations in this country. It's why I call it invisibility. It's why I and my office, Latino Justice, have been so engaged in trying to address these systems. So at a basic level, what is the Latino data gap? It is the gap of data, the lack of data on how these systems, be it law enforcement through arrests, be it the correction systems through pretrial detention or post-trial detentions, be it parole, be it probation, all of them in the aggregate is the lack of data about how Latinos are both present in these systems and how they're affected by any reforms in these systems. In that vein, the Latino data gap, both in youth and criminal justice systems, actually reflects an inability of the system to recognize that the country is far beyond its original formulation of how it deals with race in the country. Now, we all know that race is a major issue in society in 2018 in America. We all know that fully well in this conversation. But we also know that the country has morphed quite considerably between those days of slavery and days of Jim Crow. And that morphing of the country in many ways that preceded all the issues between Black and white people in this country, that change in the demographics of the country has now resulted in Latinx populations becoming the largest racial ethnic group in the entire country. And in many of our states, it's the largest racial ethnic group in any particular state. In that regard, when you look at it that way, juxtapose that demographic with what I just talked to you about the data gap, then we are talking about an inability of these bureaucracies to fully account for how they spend our money, what they're doing with the people that they impact upon, and how they actually deal with or try to address reforms that they themselves either initiate or have foisted upon them by legislatures or the courts. So the data gap issue affects the ability to know fully well the full understanding of how these systems actually operate in the United States. It is critically important. And I just want to highlight for you just one slide that I have here. And I'm hoping to just give me 1 second and I'll just share the screen. This particular slide is from our national database on Poland. We were able to use this slide when we reported on how Latinas and Latinos in this country experience the criminal justice system and some of their opinions on the criminal justice system. It's a very simple question. Do you think it's somewhat important or very important to collect data on Latinos in the criminal justice system? This slide in front of you aggregates those two answers. Either these respondents, who are all, by the way, Latino people in the United States, it's a national poll, all respondents thought it was either somewhat important or very important to collect the data. And I want you to just focus on a couple of data points. Total, 2/3 of all Latinos think it's important to collect this data. But 79% of Latinos who were stopped by police think it's important to collect the data. 78% of Latinos who have ever been arrested think it's important to collect the data. 76% of people that were victims of crime also believe it's important to collect the data. And about 78%, 79% of all Afro-Latinos in this country also believe it's important to collect the data. So when we talk about in this webinar the necessity to address the Latino data gap, we're also talking about an issue that is also already on the minds of many Latino people, Latinx communities throughout the country. They too think it's important to disaggregate the data beyond Black and white. They too think it's important to address these issues of the data gap. And they too have their own opinions about how the system affects them. So thank you very much. I'll leave it open to another set of additional questions.
Thank you, Juan. And now we're gonna have a conversation with Ryan King, who is a senior fellow at the Justice Policy Center at Urban Institute, where he works on sentencing and correction issues with a focus on mass incarceration. He is well known for producing high quality empirical research on the impact that sentencing and correction policies have at the state and federal level. And he is also very well known for working with a wide range of stakeholders. Ryan, can you Can you please tell us exactly what impact has mass incarceration and the expansion of correctional control has had on the Latinx community? You've done a lot of research, you've done a lot of data, but it would be great to kind of get a sense of the actual numbers.
Sure. Are you all seeing my screen here?
Yes, we are.
Yes, great. Okay. Thanks, Anand. And I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and speak a little bit about this work. It's something I feel really strongly about. And the reality is that, no, I can't tell you very much about the impact of mass incarceration, of expanded correctional control on Latino community, because we don't have a lot of data, and Juan was alluding to that. I have primarily in my career do a lot of data analysis, and in particular trying to do work with state level data to provide information, research data analysis to inform better, more effective criminal justice work. And it became clear to me, state after state after state, when we would try to pull data, particularly from departments of correction, and get data on race and ethnicity, among other factors, we find out that time after time, there was no ethnicity data, or it was folded in to race, and so you got very misleading numbers. To me, I was also surprised that it was in states that had particularly a high percentage of the general population that were Latino. So it was not certainly limited to states where there are not significant numbers of Latinos in the community. And so we became really interested in wanting to learn a little more about that. I do a lot of work around sort of, I mentioned, data analysis and performance measurement, and have the saying that many of you may have heard, which is if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And much of what we know around mass incarceration, much of the reforms we've seen in the last 10 years, much of the sort of general public conversation on criminal justice reform in the last decade that has really raised this to one of the leading civil rights issues in this country, has come about because of data collection. We didn't know very much about police brutality and police-involved shootings until we had some high-profile cases, and then we were like, wow, we're not collecting data on this. And once the data began to come in, the stories that many people have been telling for decades were playing out in the data we saw. And so it's really important for shaping policy change. And so what we wanted to do was go out and do kind of a baseline measure of what are states collecting across key measures, key criminal justice indicators. You can see here, the few states are including Latinos in most criminal justice data. And I want to give a couple caveats here. First off, we were looking at publicly available, readily accessible online sources of regular reporting. So this is information. States collect a lot of data, some of which they don't publish at all. From our perspective, if the data are not being collected and not being reported and published to the public, so that media, so that practitioners and policymakers have access to them, then they're not really providing a lot of use. So we were actually looking about what data exists that are out there and available that can get out into the conversation within the state. We define regularly and recently reported data as data that have been publicly reported at least twice, at least every other year, and at least as recently as 2014. So the key to take away from that is we're not just looking at states that report. You'll notice at the bottom it says show only regular and recently reported data. We're interested in both states that have done one-off reports, as well as states that are putting this in their annual report. Preferably, we would like to see this collected on an annual basis, along with other key criminal justice data, to continue to monitor trends and allow people to be aware of the impact of a lot of criminal justice policies. So you can see here, looking across the categories, we looked at 5 key measures: prison population by offense, arrests, probation population, and parole population. And you can take a look across there to get a sense of the states that are collecting these data. Only one of them, Alaska, includes all 5 measures by ethnicity. So that might come as a surprise to many folks. We took a look here. Here you can see we have boxes checked for prison population and parole population. So this is an online tool that allows you to float over, in this particular case, if you float over New York, you get a little printout here and you can see what data are being recorded. So in this particular case, New York is regularly reporting 2 types of criminal justice data: prison population data and parole population data. So stepping back and looking across the country, you can see the quality of data varies across states and agencies. 75% of states are collecting at least one measure, and a little more than a third, about 39%, are collecting 2 or more measures. Here's to get a sense of what the country looks. across on the prison population. And the categories down here to take a look at, we were looking at states that collected no race or ethnicity data, that collect regularly report race data only with no Latino or Hispanic category, those that report Latino Hispanic category as a race, those that report it in addition to race, and then those that break race down into subgroups by ethnicity. So these are sort of varying degrees from worst to best in terms of what we would like to see in providing detail. And you can see the story there with the darker colors being indicative of better reporting than most of the states are on the either reporting nothing or reporting race data only with no Latino and Hispanic category. So an example of a state like Florida that does that within their prison population is that you get a white and black number, about 48% each. And we know from data that a huge chunk of those individuals who are reporting white are likely to be Latino or Hispanic would have indicated that category and ethnicity. So not only does it not give us that information on the Latino Hispanic population, but perhaps another kind of consequence of that is that we also, it artificially changes the disparity that we see. So in that particular case, if you step back at Florida, you look and see here's a prison population, sort of equally white-black. The reality is that there's a significant disparity with communities of color versus white. Florida's not reporting that data publicly, so we're not able to see what the extent of that is. Here you can take a look at prison population by offense. Outside of our friends in Alaska, we don't have virtually anybody reporting in Kansas and Florida are reporting race data only, as I mentioned, and collapsing ethnicity within the race data. Here's another look at arrest data. We wanted to get a sense of law enforcement, not just corrections. A little bit of a varied picture here as well. One of the other things I wanted to throw out here as we look through these slides is about 3/4 of Latinos live in only 10 states. And so again, I think we were really interested in, is this a function of states where there better data are in states where there is a higher number of Latinos, and I think Alaska clearly answers that question, which is that's not the case. And in fact, California, Florida, and New Mexico, states with very high Latino populations, report ethnicity data in fewer categories than the average state. So it is not at all, the percentage and representation of people within the state does not have really any bearing on whether and how that state is collecting and reporting data. And here's a little bit of information here so you can get a look. Again, the key takeaway being here that states with large Latino populations do not necessarily have better data. So finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, good policy demands good data. And so we have a few recommendations here that I'd like to share coming out. As I mentioned earlier, there's kind of this spectrum of ways in which data are reported. It is our strong recommendation that states should at the very least be meeting Census Bureau standards of collecting race and ethnicity data separately prior to combining them, so that allows us to have more descriptive and accurate subcategories such as non-Hispanic white, Hispanic black. These are some of the census categories, and allows us again to be able to break ethnicity out from data. Data need to be collected and publicly reported at least once every 2 years. This more frequent data collection obviously allows us to keep up on trends, allows us to identify where there's particular problems, and it empowers policymakers and empowers the public to get engaged and involved in this issue by informing them of the impact of a lot of the criminal justice policies. And then finally, the self-reported issue is a really important one. In many cases, individuals, when they enter prison or when they enter the criminal justice system, their race or ethnicity data is input by the person who is handling the survey. So an individual does not always have the opportunity to self-report, and I could share a lot of really crazy stories about ways in which people, as they're being admitted to prison, have an individual sitting behind a clipboard making a determination of where that person stands for race and ethnicity without any sort of input from the person, and it may be sort of significantly in conflict with the way that individual identifies himself. So we think it's very important, in addition to meeting Census Bureau standards, to collecting and reporting regularly also, that the data themselves that are collected should be self-reported and reflecting the way an individual identifies themselves. So that is it from me. I'm happy to answer some questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Ryan. As you can see, it is clear we are present, but we are invisible, and there is no reason why all states should be not counting us as people, and the impact on the criminal justice system. And now we have Marcia Rincon-Gallardo, who is founder and executive director of Noxtin, Equal Justice for All, which is a youth justice organization providing training, technical assistance, consultation on how to reduce racial and ethnic disparities for both girls and young people of color in the youth justice system. And for the past 3 decades, she has been committed to serving and building the capacity of youth, the parents who participate in the policy changes for system improvements. Marcia, can you please let us know the impact that this data gap has on youth and the families?
Yes, I will. And let me turn on and share my screen so that you could see. I hope you can see. Can you see it now? The PowerPoint? Okay, great. So thank you, first of all, good morning and good afternoon to the Latino Justice and to you, Juan Cartagena, and for inviting me to speak, and Ana for facilitating, and all my colleagues. I want to start first, as you know, traditionally, among all of our peoples, just an acknowledgement of all of our ancestors, those from this hemisphere and those from across the pond. Just remembering that we have many, many, many ancestors from all over this world. And I just want to take a moment to just think of that. And then moving into what we know and what we don't know. This is very important because without knowing what we know in this arena, it's difficult for us to then be able to ask for and demand what we need to know. And so here, what I'm going to share is just a very snippet of what we do know. So in this United States, there is not one single state that does not have Latino youth, Latino parents, Latino communities. Having said that, 1 in 4 children in this United States is Latinx youth, 90% which are born in the United States. So there's a lot of myths around this country about our youth. 10 states have the greatest numbers of Latinx youth, and I will show you a map right after this slide. Of those Latino youth, 7.9 million, or 24% of our total youth population from the ages of 10 to 17, which that is the age range of youth who would be the pool that would land up in some detention facility across this country. And then if we were to look, and this is very outdated because that's the way these things roll, is that in a 1-day count in 2013, when they counted all youth sitting in some kind of a residential placement detention facility corrections, there were 23% that were Latinx, 12,291. And then of those, we know from great research that is being done by our colleagues, including Angela Irvine, Dr. Angela Irvine, we know that 40% of all detained youth across this country are gender nonconforming, LGBTQ, and in California, 50% are gender nonconforming. And given that California has a great majority of Latinx youth sitting in detention facilities, we know that we need to pay attention to our young people that are gender fluid. The other thing that we know is that having said these numbers are not really valid. And the reason why they're not valid is because Latinx youth still get counted as whites all over the stages of from arrest to disposition. Now, this here shows you the map of the states that have the greatest, so the darkest states, California, Arizona, Nuevo Mexico, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York, even New Jersey. They have the largest population of our Latino youth. And so you would think that these would be the states that would have the best data collection on Latinx youth, but in fact, they are not. Among what we don't know is the decision points from arrest all the way to disposition, broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, and SOGI data. Now, why don't we have this data? Latinx girls get pushed into and aggregated into all girls. We never, in any particular state, it's rare to find, if at all, any data regarding our Latinx girls. And then also knowing the self-report, whether Latinx youth get to self-report who they are, or whether it's law enforcement who first approaches a young person after being referred. And if law enforcement writes on a report that he sees this youth to be African-American as opposed to Afro-Latino, then that's what stays on the report all throughout this young person's navigation through the youth justice system. Last but not least, there's a whole lot we want to know, but very much particularly, we want to know if our Latinx youth are actually completing probation, are completing alternatives to detention, are completing diversion, and if not, why? Why do we spend so many thousands and millions of dollars on probation, alternatives to detention, when our youth are continually coming right back into the system? So why does it even matter? Why does it matter that we want to know this Latinx data? Well, we know from what our colleague just said, Ryan, that data is critical to the detention reform process of decreasing arrests and detentions. We know that there have been great models in this country that have been proven, tested, proven effective. And yet Latinx youth, without having that data, we don't know whether we're actually faring well in those very productive and successful models. The absence of data, both quantitative and qualitative, prevents us, our communities, from identifying the correct policy and practices that need to be changed in order to decrease how many of our youth are sitting in detention. And so without that data, not only being released to our communities, but also broken down in the right ways, really puts us out of the discussions to be able to change the system. I'm going to show you some examples here of what we do want to see. So in Santa Clara County, here where I live, they put this information on the internet. So it's transparent and publicly available. So what you see here in the circle that I'm circling in red is you see the arrests. Not only first you see population percent. So in Santa Clara County, Latinx youth 10 to 17 are 35%, but their arrests are at 65%. You also see the actual number. So if you were to look at this, you would see that Latinx youth are the most arrested in this county. If you look at here, a different way of looking at it, it's a pie chart. So we see that 35%, the light gray is 35% population, 65% arrested. Here in this circle, what you see is the detentions. So while, okay, from arrest, you drop down to detention, 679 Latinx youth were detained in 216 in Santa Clara County. Yet we are 35% of the population and 74% of all kids detained. So again, this is disproportionality, and we need to be able to know this. What you see here is girls and boys broken down, but what you don't see is by race and ethnicity. And last, this is a very important data variable that really needs to be known all over this country, and that is the risk assessment instrument, so that you can see of those detained, how many are low and medium risk. We don't say that high-risk youth should not be detained. There is reason why to detain high-risk youth, but low-risk youth on a risk assessment instrument says we should be releasing them outright, and medium-risk youth is to be sent to alternatives to detention. Yet, in Santa Clara County, we know that Latinx youth are being detained at very high rates for low and medium risk reasons. And so those would be the numbers that we as a community would want to come in and say, what are we doing with those youth? Why are we still detaining these youth when they could, and your risk assessment instrument says that they should be released? That is the reason why we need to know this data. Last but not least, two more points before I let you go. And that is that our youth, we are talking about our youth without our youth. And we need to have our youth sitting at our tables to be able to work with us and tell us what has worked, what hasn't worked, being at those tables to really hold our systems accountable. Last but not least, the National Alianza for Latino Youth Justice. We are a young organization working towards continuing to address these issues of Latinx youth in the juvenile justice system. For any of you interested in knowing more, please contact me. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But for now, this is what I wanted to share. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely powerful testament that is the lack of data is definitely having an impact on both adults and youth. Now we have Angel Sanchez. Angel Sanchez is a law student in the University of Miami, and he is very involved in many criminal justice issues in Florida. He recently wrote an award-winning thesis during his time as a research scholar at the University of Central Florida, where he analyzed Florida's DOC data and revealed that systemic misclassification of Hispanics in Florida's Department of Criminal Justice. But Angel also knows the impact that the criminal and youth justice system has on individuals. He himself was once upon a time a teen who lived in the inner cities of Miami, who grew up surrounded by drugs and crime and violence. And by the time he was 16 years old, he was tried as an adult and spent over 12 years in Florida's prison system, where he was classified as white, non-Hispanic male, where his experiences have made him a subject matter expert on many criminal and youth justice issues. Angel, thank you so much for being with us. Can you please explain to us what it is that you found so striking? We know that the DOC is, although the DOC does not publicly export data, they do in fact collect data on Latinos, but can you please give us a little bit of your sense of what you found while you were doing your research as most outstanding?
Certainly. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to all the panelists and those that are viewing. Excited about this. And I just want to highlight that one of the most important things about what I found was what I thought I would find, which is that the Hispanic category is being deflated or artificially reduced. And by virtue of that, because many of the individuals are being classified as white, therefore the white category is being artificially inflated. That is what I found. But I think what is more important, and I oftentimes I'm an advocate by nature. So I like to point out the problems that need to be fixed. And today I'm excited to say that today I'm a bearer of hopeful news. In this research, what I was able to discover was a method that it's actually elementary and has been available in the redistricting and apportionment arena on how to measure how Hispanic or how Latinx a particular community is. And so what I did is I essentially took that method and applied it to the DOC data to give me a sense of what it really looked like, to map out what the Latinx community looked like at the most conservative estimates. And I will show you a little bit of it as I pull up now my screen. What I will like to highlight though, before I begin talking about what I call an interim method, at the end, we want to make sure that we have the Department of Corrections and all criminal justice systems actually collecting that data correctly. And but in the meantime, and even when they do collect it, we have to have a method where we could trust but verify. And so that's what my research was able to use, and then therefore reveal the unfortunate systematic misclassification. But before I begin, what I like to highlight is how I came to know about this research. As you suggested, Ana, I served over 12 years in Florida's prison system, in addition to being in and out of the juvenile justice system from the ages of 12 to 16. And what you see here on your screen right now is my prison ID. If you notice in the race category, it has white. And for many individuals that don't have a nuanced understanding, or that would say, well, white is the race, your ethnicity is Hispanic. And as Ryan King mentioned earlier, what happens in Florida is that they have it all clustered into and folded into the race category. But what is more striking for me, particularly, was that, as Ryan King mentioned, the Department of Corrections in Florida publishes an annual report. And I worked in the law library and I saw that annual report. And that annual report tells us that you have a Black category of about 40+%. You have a white category of about 40+%. And then you have an other category that's less than 5%. So my understanding as I saw that was, well, I have to pick between white, black, or other. And in fact, I don't get to pick. The officers who classified me had to pick between black, white, or other. And that's how I ended up being white. Until I started seeing some of the inmates coming into the Florida prisons, and they had Hispanic on their cards, but the majority still had white. Here and there, you'll find certain individuals with Hispanic. And so I still remember saying, you know, among the Latino community, we like to tease each other how one person is more Hispanic or more Latinx than another. And I still remember asking the correction officers, requesting to have my ID adjusted, since now I know there is a Hispanic category available. And I would be really confronted with a statement such as, do you want to go to confinement? In other words, stop shaking the boat. Or more to the point, that is petty. Or more particularly, if it was a white officer, it was more like, do you have a problem with being white? Because if you do, then you have a problem with me. So I let resting dogs lay, and obviously didn't want to go to confinement because of it, and would spend the next 12 years classified as white, knowing darn well that I was Hispanic. And so as I then got out, I would go on to move into a homeless shelter and become an honor student and start doing research at the University of Central Florida. There, I encountered what was very striking to me as I did research on felony disenfranchisement. And what I found was particular scholars doing what they call counterfactual research, which is what-if analysis. And in that what-if analysis, they were trying to determine, what if individuals who are in prison or formerly convicted were able to vote in Florida, because Florida permanently disenfranchises individuals. And in that what-if analysis, they take demographics into consideration. And in this researcher's article, what surprised me, or actually didn't surprise me, but bothered me, was that this researcher noted that she was using Florida Department of Corrections data. And according to that data, the Hispanic population in Florida's prison is too small to consider. And therefore, she found that to be somewhat suspect because Florida has a very large Hispanic population. And she applied a surname list that unfortunately was not empirical, which produced the same result that she wanted, or at least that she assumed, which was that the Hispanic population in Florida are too small to consider. I knew that to be wrong. I brought that up to my research mentor, and his response is, we need to prove it. It is not enough that you had this experience. And so therefore, my mentor pointed me in the direction of this method that was used in the West Coast on apportionment and redistricting. I say all of that to say that we need to have advocates and researchers that have been impacted. This individual researcher who I ran across had no nefarious reasons to assume that the DOC data was correct. However, her lack of experience or exposures to individuals who have had these experiences prevented her from digging deeper, but it prompted me to dig deeper. And that's why I titled this slide, Impacted Advocates and Researchers Encouraged to Apply. Now, what did we find? Well, what we found once we did the adjustments, that according to the DOC data, as of January 2017, there were 4% Hispanics. One would argue too small to consider. But when we did, on a conservative end, adjusted the data with the methods that we used, it bumped up to nearly 12%. That means that there is almost 300% more Hispanics than the data that DOC has reflects. And where did that number come from? If you look to the bottom, it came from the white category. So as the Hispanic category, and when it's adjusted, goes up, most of the individuals that were misclassified were being classified as white. This research, obviously, it's a conservative estimate. It's one that I wanted to use to hopefully challenge the Department of Corrections to start considering the suggestions that the Urban Institute has put out and follow the Census Bureau's practices. Now, the most important thing that I want to share today is, how do you apply this research so that you, who are now on the fronts on this issue, don't have to depend on DOC in the meantime? And even if DOC does collect data, I like to think that the only thing worse than no data is having bad data, as the experience I had with a particular researcher who was taking the DOC data at face value. So what are the methods? Okay, well, this doesn't allow me to go to the next slide, unfortunately. And so if possible, let's see if I can do it there. There you go. So there is a rough estimate way that you could go about doing this. And I like to point out that our approach will have to depend and depends heavily on the 2000 census, which is another point that I like to make, that for that reason, we want to protect the census. Here you get a ratio between a highly Hispanic and a highly non-Hispanic name based on the 2000 census data. You create a ratio of it. That is, for every one Gonzalez, you might have 1.07 or 1.07 Andersons. For every one Anderson, you have 1.07 Gonzalez. And the Hispanic population in the 2000 census is about 17%. So you go into the data and you do the same kind of fraction and you divide the two and come up with a ratio. And if you notice, the ratio is a little bit smaller than what is in the two census data, which leads us to assume that then the Hispanic population is about a little bit smaller than what you would find in the national population. So about 15%. Once you have that, this is a rough estimate. This is how you could test any Department of Corrections data that you have access to. And once you have it, what you do is you take that rough estimate and you see this table to your left and you apply and you look where did that estimate fall. So here it would fall in between the 0.1 and the 0.2. And it tells you, go to the census data, and this is based on the census data, and use the top Hispanic numbers and cut off at, in my case, it was somewhere in the 4,000 area. Once you have those numbers, those names, then you just apply it to the database and change every single individual in that database to Hispanic who is on that list. Anyone who is not on that database, you turn them into non-Hispanic. If they happen to have been Hispanic, you change them to unknown or other. And then you just run frequencies and it'll give you an estimate. And as you noticed earlier, it pushed the Hispanic population from 4% to nearly 12% in the Florida Department of Corrections. Now, there is an objection you will probably encounter from the Department of Corrections, which is saying, we don't want to let individuals self-identify because they're going to manipulate it and it's a security threat. We need to know what people look like in order to, in case of an escape, in order to identify them. And my response to them is, one, Hispanic or Latinx is not a complexion. Here is an example of an individual right now currently in the Department of Corrections, according to their database, who's being labeled white. Strikingly, to us, we'll say that person doesn't look white. Here is another individual in the Department of Corrections, Armando Garcia, who's also labeled white. And I would challenge all of us to think about what was our first reaction. This person probably does kind of look white. And that is the very problem that we have in the Department of Corrections. We're allowing individuals to subjectively determine who looks quote unquote white. If we advocates are quote unquote woke, and when we saw this, we're like, well, this person may look white, we already fall into the trap of subjectively telling someone else what they look like. And so how do you fix this? You allow Armando Garcia and you allow Andres Garcia to self-identify. And there we will get a better reflection of what the Latinx community looks like in the prison population, commensurate with what we see in the census. For more of this research, I have it here on my honors thesis. Here's the link to it. The chapter 3 of it gives you the methods. I'm hoping that we can now take this and start applying it to all the Department of Corrections, to all the local county jails. And so we could start mapping out how Latinx are being impacted. Thank you, and I'll take some questions afterwards.
Angel, what an inspiration you are to all of us for all of the incredible work you're doing. And it's just, you're absolutely right. People that are impacted directly, it is critical that we listen and that we all join forces together to resolve the issues that are impacting both the youth as well as adult system. We're now open to questions. And in the meantime, we have a comment from our Facebook friend, Keith Harris, who raises a point that having accurate ethnic data is serious info that must be collected and transparent, and that is exactly correct. Is there anybody else from the panelists that would like to speak to any of the points that were made as people are asking any questions via Facebook?
Yes, this is Juan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Actually, this question is for Marcia in California, especially what you were sharing with us from Santa Clara. Is it my sense that that what you were able to find for that county is not readily available for every county in California? And if so, how were you able to get it?
That's a very good question. We have colleagues here in Santa Clara County that have been doing this work of looking at reform for quite a few years. And so they're very transparent about their data. A couple of other counties, there's some counties in California that have done JDI work. There's some counties that have done work with the Haywood Burns Institute. And they're usually a little bit more open to being transparent. If you're a community member and you belong to, you want to belong to the collaboratives that get built to actually address issues of decreasing the numbers of youth of color in the juvenile justice system, you can approach these collaboratives and participate. However, there are many, many other counties. There's 58 counties in California. There's a lot of counties, not only in California, but throughout this country that will not release their data. And that is where you really do have to develop a strategy to either go to your board of supervisors or your commissioners and say it is public information and it should be made available for us to be able to see and disaggregate it in the way that we need it to be disaggregated so that we can be able to advocate strongly for reforms, for alternatives to detention to decrease those numbers. You know, it's structural racism. And until we dismantle this mass incarceration, it's going to be our communities, Black and brown communities, that get the most impacted.
So thank you so much for that. What will you say to anybody who wants to get involved, who wants to participate in effectively advocating for the recommendations that all of you outlined? Can each one of you just briefly say how to get a hold of you, how to get information for those listening?
Sure. So they can reach me at Noxtin. So Noxtin stands for all of us in Nahuatl. And given that there has been such a strong binary, we definitely support Black Lives Matters. And yet when we talk about including us, we're not saying exclude anybody else. We're actually asking and really standing forward and saying we need to be included when we use the term youth of color. And so you can reach me at marcia@noxtin.org as to get any information about anywhere in the country and what kind of work is being done regarding youth justice, either detention reform and or grassroots work.
What about you, Urban or Juan or Angel?
He's on mute.
Muted from the, all right. I just said something brilliant and now it was muted away. Thanks, Anna. For folks who are interested in taking a look at the data that I shared, there's some interactive graphics. You go to the Urban website and you can just sort of do in the search box for alarming lack of data and it should pop up there. You can also reach me. My email address is rking, R-K-I-N-G, @urban.org.
Yeah, and my name again is Angel Sanchez. You could reach me at AES, which stands for Ángel Enrique Sanchez, AES at 258@miami.edu. You could also reach me through Latino Justice. I will have my PowerPoint slides offered to Latino Justice, so anybody that would like to have them can feel free to use them. And the suggestions I have for any advocates, from my time in the Senate, one of the things that I learned was how do we get agencies to change their policies? And one thing that agencies have to do is they have to come to the legislator to ask for appropriations. And it is at that moment that you have a legislator who's on that appropriation committee that demands that the agency make some changes if they want this kind of funding. And it is that how you'll start seeing some of the changes within the institution. Additionally, the reason I think this is very important is because one, if you use the interim method, you could start showing those legislators how they're depending, their data-driven policy decisions are dependent on bad data. And so that would probably motivate them to do that. And lastly, particularly places like Florida, where a lot of our Hispanic legislators are conservative, if we start showing them how the Hispanic community is being impacted, then you get the Hispanic caucus on board. And by virtue of that, you get also some conservatives on board. So those are my suggestions. One, to how to get to the agencies to respond. Two, how do you get the legislators to feel, get the shock effect of the bad data? And three, why we need this.
And Angel, you're getting a lot of requests to download your dissertation. Can you please let us know how we can get access to that award-winning dissertation?
Thank you. It's a thesis. I did not get a PhD. I came to law school, and part of the reason that this is very important is I am not a math person. So this only points to how easy it is to apply this method. This does not take rocket science. You basically need to estimate, use the table, plug it in, get some results. And you could definitely, it's at the end of the PowerPoint, so it'll be available there. It's also at the end of the bio that we gave the individuals that were invited to the webinar. And also Latino Justice will be able to have the link to it.
Anna, I wanted to jump in and say one last thing. That's great, Angel. I really appreciate all the work that you have been doing. And I'm so happy to be part of the family of Latino Justice, to be able to join the work being done. I wanted to just share real quickly that here in California, about 2 years ago, working with an assemblywoman by the name of Nora Campos, we I sponsored a bill by the name of AB 1998, which at the time that we wrote it, it was requiring and mandating that Latinos get counted as Latinos in the youth justice system. Little did I know about that process, but it did get watered down, and it did get passed and signed by the governor to recommend that counties count Latinos as Latinos. And so I want to encourage any of you from all over this country to look into that you may be able to do that in your own state, and be able to move this forward in a way that's really impactful, because to do it county by county by county just takes forever. But to be able to do this at a state level could be extremely meaningful to be able to collect better data. So I just wanted to share that much.
Marcia, that is a wonderful, wonderful example. We don't have a lot of time left, but before we log off, Juan, would you mind speaking about the incredible Justice Collaborative work that you've been doing? And then Marcia, our dear friend Marcia Mistred has a question for Urban. And the question is, do you look at youth certified as adults in its data?
All right, so let me start, and then we'll have Ryan answer that particular question. So basically, the Justice Reform Collaborative here at Latino Justice is our full center that deals with mobilization of people. It deals with community engagement. It deals with narrative change. It deals with policy analysis and research, and also deals with litigation, because at the end of the day, Latino Justice is really a collection of excellent attorneys who look for ways to try to address the system by using the courts whenever we have to. All of our information, particularly if you're very interested in this topic, please contact us. We are right now I'm gonna try to share what I have here very quickly. But we basically have 3 people on the staff who are on part of this call. My name is Juan Cartagena, so that's J Cartagena at latinojustice.org. Jeronimo Saldaña is on our team. That's J Saldana at latinojustice.org. And Christian Perez is on our team. He's also in the background of this webinar, C. Perez at latinojustice.org. We're on Facebook at Latino Justice, and our website is latinojustice.org. You should also know that if you're in the California area in May, we have already scoped out the following dates, the 29th, the 30th, and the 31st of May. We're going to do a convening of Latinos and Latinx people in throughout the country, but of course dedicated to people in California, in both LA, Los Angeles, and also in Bakersfield, California, between those 3 days, May 29, 30, and 31.
Thank you. Ryan, for your question from Marcy, did Urban look at the certification of adults?
So we did not. We were looking at the basic questions across prison population, prison by offense, arrest, probation population, and parole population. So as a sort of first project, we were kind of taking what we thought were the high level absolute musts that we should be seeing collected and reported publicly. We did not do deeper dives into some of the subcategories, but I think that's a really important question and one that we should keep in mind for further exploration.
So this is only the beginning of an ongoing conversation that we all have to have. Thank you all for the incredible work, for the passion, for the determination to make sure that Latinos are no longer invisible within the criminal and juvenile justice data. And thank you everybody for logging in, listening. We are available if you have any questions, and hasta la victoria.